I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. We'll have our panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but in the meantime, we hope that wherever you are, if you're in front of a desk, if you're on a couch, if you're in transportation from one place to another, you're cozy, you have a meal, you have some refreshments. I know that where I am, it is incredibly hot. And so we want to thank you all for being here. As we have this conversation, we want to encourage folks to be part of it. So if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, please feel free to use the Q&A box to share them throughout, and we'll make sure to leave a little bit of time at the end for our panelists to respond to some of them. But we also want you to feel comfortable just engaging with each other. We know that webinars can sometimes feel a little bit separate and isolating, and so it's really nice for us to be in conversation with one another. We do have language interpretations. So for attendees who are Francophone and prefer French language captioning, this will be available through a link that is going to be shared in the chat with you all. And with that in mind, we're at 12:04. I have been looking forward to this panel literally all month, and I think from the very moment that we came up with this idea. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. Thank you so much to our three panelists for being here, for love, care, and community-centered change. And I'm going to throw it over to Lori for the very first panelist to introduce herself, and then we'll hand it over to Nikki and then finish up with Géorgie.
Awesome. Tansei, hello, good morning or afternoon, I guess, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm just really happy to be here, so thank you for inviting me. I am going to begin in Cree, even though I'm not fluent in it, and my pronunciation I know is far from perfect. But the late Elder Isidore Palchier once told me that, the fact that I find myself in this situation is not my shame to bear. And reminded me about our languages being forcibly removed from our ancestors. And he told me that rather than being concerned about my pronunciation or afraid of trying to speak my language, that it's more important to, stand tall and to be proud and to speak my language every opportunity that I get and to continue to learn new words as a way to honor and our ancestors who worked very hard to preserve our languages and with it our cultures and our way of life and our beliefs and interconnectedness and resilience of life. So nanasko mama wao tama mau mitini miwa sinko takisigawe wapatamak lori kambon sikasun muniawi sagihiganik gitsia sotamatawin kiwitanok Saskatchewan Ochini Amaga Uskanaka Sastaki Sawanok Newigan Nia Two Spirit Tastawini Wak Neheo Pitokosasanaskwayo Nichijayatan Otayayan Kistito Hinawao Miwasan Taskamau. So I started off by giving a short thank you to the creator because it's so beautiful that we get to see another day. And in reality and in truth, I pretty much say that line every day when when I find myself awake, because there's a lot going on in this world, and to be able to wake up and see another day is really an honor and a privilege. I introduced myself and said that I'm from Montreal Lake, Treaty 6 territory in northern Saskatchewan, but I live in the south in Regina. And I said that I'm a Two-Spirit Cree Métis woman and that I'm very happy to be joining you all here today. I'm joining from Treaty 4 territories, and these are the territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. And like the lands of my ancestors in Treaty 6, I recognize that these particular lands have always been a source of learning for Indigenous peoples here, and I am committed to respecting the traditional knowledge that they have gained from these lands and to learning from their experiences on them. And I also invite all of you to do the same in the lands that you're joining us from today. As mentioned, it is my privilege to hold the inaugural position of Associate Vice President, Indigenous Engagement at the University of Regina, which is my alma mater. And 30 years ago, when I walked through the doors to play basketball, I never envisioned that this is where I would be at this point in my life. But other than that, I just want to share that I share about who I am in the way that I did, not necessarily because it defines me, but it does tell you a bit about who I am and where I come from. It also tells you about like the lens through which I experience the world. So, Kinis Gomatinawal, thank you.
Thank you, Lori. And Nikki, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Thank you, Laurie. It's really nice to meet you. Uvanga Nikki Komaksiutiksak. I am originally from Chesterfield and Lit Nunavut, but Treaty 1 territory has been where I have lived for the majority of my life. I am a former child in care of the child welfare system. I have a sister that was murdered when we were 17 while in the care of Child and Family Services. So I have a lot of lived experience in some of the traumatic, experiences that a lot of Indigenous folks have faced over the course of centuries, really. First and foremost, I am a mother of 5. I have 3 adult children and 2 younger children. They are why I do what I do. I am the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer and CEO of Pauktuutit Inuit Women of Canada. I like to say also that through my lived experiences and some of the traumatic experiences that I've gone through with some of these, systemic inequities and barriers, those lived experiences really helped me to kind of come up with ways to ensure that Inuit folks in urban settings are appropriately taken care of. And so I've had the privilege of creating 2 Inuit organizations in Manitoba, the Manitoba Inuit Association in 2008 with 3 other Inuit women. And recently in 2019, Dungasugit Inuit Resource Center located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, first resource center in Western Canada. And so from forming that then to becoming the CEO there, gaining a lot of experience in some of the barriers and inequities that Inuit folks face across this country. And so I'm in treaty. I'm actually not familiar, and I apologize. I am on Algonquin territory in Ottawa, and that's where I am. And it's nice to meet everyone, and I'm excited for this conversation. Kuya na meet.
And Géorgie, if you could introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Wacha, Géorgie Zinkasun, Chikumdodum, Waswanipi Uistchi, Uchinitawe, Nagawi Chigium, Karakwini Wejin, Quebec City Nishipun Tagungun, Nishtahiwin. Hello everyone, my name is Géorgie. I use she and they pronouns in English, elle est là en français avec les accords au féminin. I introduced myself in Cree as well. Laurie, it was lovely to hear you speak your Cree. We speak different Cree. I'm not fluent either in mine. The Cree that my family and my ancestors spoke is the Eastern James Bay Cree, and particularly the Southern dialects. What I said is that I am of mixed heritage, and so my dad is Cree from the Cree First Nation of Waswanipi, which is a Cree community in the north of Quebec, about an hour and a half northeast of Val d'Or. It's a community of about 1,800 people. And my mother is franco-québécoise with roots in the Buds from Saint-Laurent and Chaudière-Appalaches. And I grew up in an urban context in Quebec City. I am Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit in Eastern James Bay Cree's Nishtahiyuwin, which translates to two-hearted people, which I find very beautiful as this translation in our language. I am a 3rd generation residential school survivor. My grandmother, Mary Alice Gull, went to a residential school in Sault Ste. Marie, and so she was displaced as well to a full different province and region. And Yeah, I also wanted to share a word. I tried to activate Cree as much as I can, and I'm learning very slowly. I'm 10 hours away from my community, and I've met one a speaker of a similar Cree here in Cataraqui, where I live, which is colonial in the known as Kingston in Ontario, and it's the traditional language territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. I met one woman named Annie Wapachi, who is from a community just 45 minutes outside of my community called Bugumu. And so I'm trying to learn as much as I can. And a word that I learned recently is Chinika Nishimu, which means she or he dances in a circle. And I am very excited today to be, through conversation, through dialogue, dancing in a circle with Nikki, Lori, and Harar. And so, Chimigwech. Oh, and I guess I'm an artist, and I'm the founder of a consulting agency called Géorgie Gagné, Communities and Solidarities, and we focus on the well-being of racialized, disabled, 2SLGBTQIA plus community members across Turtle Island.
All of you have such like rich and storied introductions that I love that you were like, oh, and I guess I also do this professionally. Thank you so much, Georgie. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Lori. As our panelist said, I'm Harar Hall. I'm here on behalf of Volunteer Canada, supporting in the convening of this conversation. My pronouns are they, them, or yel en français. I personally am located in Géorgie Gagné, which is colonially known as Montreal, which is the traditional territories of the Kanagahagan Nation. But I am here representing Volunteer Canada, and I wanted to allow our panelists to introduce themselves first, because I think that the fact of the matter of being both a pan-Canadian organization, but also just being in so many places, is that as we are in conversation with one another, we are often also in conversation with different lands, different nations, different treaty holders, different land defenders, different nations on unceded and unsurrendered territories, on lands that they're still defending, on lands that they have, historical rights over or current rights over, or in conversations with colonial governments. And there is no one blanket territory acknowledgement that speaks to an organization like Volunteer Canada, because to speak to us as just being, covering Turtle Island, I think would do a disservice to the variation of nations and peoples that we are in conversation with. And I think when we're having a conversation about volunteering, about nonprofits, about communities, about participation, it is also impossible to divorce all of the systems that we are a part of from the harm that those systems have done to Indigenous nations, to Indigenous peoples, and to peoples who have been settled here through other forms of colonialism and displacement. And so I wanted to speak to that, not necessarily to cast a pall over this conversation, but to place us, and I think in a very important time and place, knowing that we are in different places, but we are very, very lucky, and I'm very excited to speak about this today. But I think it's just incredibly important that us as Volunteer Canada and the folks here who are in this room with us listening also take a second when we do these territory acknowledgements, when we place ourselves and connect ourselves to the land we're on, to do that reflection as well, because our land acknowledgements, our territory acknowledgements won't be yours. You will be in different places, you will be connected to different peoples, and so we encourage you to do that at moments like this when we're having sort of pan-Canadian conversations. With that in mind, I am so excited to begin this conversation. And I know oftentimes, because you folks do this work professionally, you are consultants, you are educators, you are, EDs and CEOs of pan-Canadian and national organizations, and you have worked in so many different places. And it's easy to attach community involvement, I think, really largely to what you're doing currently professionally in this moment. And I actually like to go back to the origins of where we find our footing in this work. And so I'd love to hear from our panelists. How did you begin participating in community-based work, and how has that changed over time? And we'll start with you, Georgie.
Sure, yeah, I could think of two ways to answer that question. I think back to my origin of community-based work. And as I said, I grew up in an urban context in Quebec City, and I think I started getting involved pretty much when I was in like grade 7, which is the start of high school in that province, which is a 5-year high school journey. And I joined something that was called the Jonathan Peer Brigade, which was like a little brigade that would go around the corridors of our high school during breaks and lunch times, and we would do peer support with youth if they needed any help with homework, if they needed, like they were getting bullied by someone, then we could go and seek the support that they needed. And so I think that's how I started getting involved, and then went on to like do arts and dance and theater for like the majority of my youth as well. And so that led to a lot of organizing and wanting to be with people and create things together. But more recently, in the past 6 years at this point, I started getting involved in advocacy and 2SLGBTQIA plus anti-racism work. And that was truly just out of a need for community. I just didn't not want to feel isolated. I wanted to be with people that saw the world and like imagined a future similar to how I imagined it. And so I one day just randomly joined the board of this organization called Franco-Queer, which is the provincial Ontarian Association for Queer and Trans Franco-Ontarians. And I knew nothing about governance, but quickly I became the first Indigenous and the first trans feminine vice chair and then chair of that organization. And I learned so much in there. And then that led me to do national work with queer and trans organizations with the organization called Enchanté Network. And so I was doing some indigenization within queer and trans spaces and advocacy with different bodies of power. And that's what led me to do this work today.
Thank you for that. And I love that transition from like helping people in kind of like, you know, the space that you're in, which is school, to that like that call for belonging and for not being isolated to like lead to your advocacy work. I think that's such a beautiful entry point. Nikki?
Yeah, that is very beautiful. I had touched on my introduction as a former child in care, and so my idea of community work and educating really started when I was about 9 years old. I left Nunavut when I was 6 because my mom is a product of the residential school system and unfortunately couldn't take care of me. Moved to Winnipeg to live with her sister, who had been, settled in that urban setting. Lived with my 3 cousins. We were about the same age. And one day we were listening to APTN, and we were listening to elders throat singing, and we were like, OMG, that sounds so cool. And, at the time we were like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. And we went upstairs and we just thought, we're going to try making those cool noises. And my aunt heard something within us, and really almost it felt like immediately after that we were traveling the world, showcasing Inuit culture, throat singing in our language, making albums, educating folks about Inuit, and then really early on finding out everywhere that no one knew who Inuit were. And if they did, it was misconcepted ideas of who we were and how we lived. And so, a lot of things that I heard growing up were, do you guys still live in igloos? And you guys only eat raw meat? And it's like, we are more than that. And so unfortunately, my aunt wasn't the greatest caregiver, and we experienced a lot of severe abuse. And so me and my sister had run away. And so from 13 into 21, I was in the care of child and family services. Lost connection with my family. They were all in Navutulasa with my mother, and really kind of was lost. Had children, started having children at 15. By the time I was 19, I had 3 children, and I had no supports whatsoever. And I just longed for the connection of my people, my stories, the traditional aspects of our culture. I longed for that for so long. And so ways in which I started giving back, or how I felt that I could help my people was, back in the late 1900s, not 1900s, the 1999, about that time. I was hearing of a lot of Inuit living in urban settings that were passing away and being, buried into the cemeteries in urban settings, and I found that very disturbing. And I felt that our Inuit, just deserve to be repatriated back to their home communities to be buried appropriately and to be back on their lands. And so very early on, I was about 21, I started assisting in that kind of work, just making phone calls, assisting, making, writing out paperwork for families to ensure that, because of the experience of my sister being murdered when we were 17 and absolutely having no supports, that was the catalyst for me to ensure that Inuit were being supported, as best as they could be in an urban setting. And that just really paved way for the various resource centers that were created, so that Inuit weren't falling through these systemic cracks, and that they had equitable access to health care, identification, basic needs, and just really advocating for Inuit inclusion in an urban context. And so that's kind of been my drive, and that's how it started. So
Thank you so much for sharing that, Nikki. And yeah, I can't imagine the emotional care that it takes to support people in their grief while also supporting them in their isolation in an urban setting. And I'm not Inuit, obviously, but I am so grateful for the work that you've done, because I can only imagine the impact that that has had on your community. Lori?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I often really don't think of myself as what we call a community-based worker. I think, I mean, I understand what it means, and I hear it, and I feel like the terminology, is new and has become a way to describe ways of indigenous, and in this instance, indigenous peoples' cultures and ways of interacting, right? Natural ways of interacting. Um, I would say so I was from the 60s scoop, and my mom was 15 when she had me, and I ended up in care for a couple of years and then was adopted into a non-indigenous Mormon family in Northeast Saskatchewan. And and they seemingly had a fair bit of resources, and I remember doing things, and it was really upsetting for them, and I didn't understand why, but because I had everything that I needed, and I always had money in my pocket, and I would go to school, and somebody would like my t-shirt, who I knew didn't have the ability to get a t-shirt like that, and I'd swap them t-shirts. So they'd go home with my brand new Converse t-shirt that my parents bought me, and I'd be wearing something else, and that wasn't as fancy, or I'd be they'd be like, well, what happened to all your allowance? And I'll be like, well, I bought you know other kids things and stuff, and I think um that way of being for me was seemed normal, and I think probably as much as my parents at the time didn't like that, the more it made me want to focus on things like that. um Other things, I guess that would be, community-based work would be like when I was in Waterloo and when COVID hit, and just trying to our local community center, where would have that had a high Indigenous population, and would be fed a meal every day, got shut down. And so just knowing that that happened, I just told my boss at work, and said, and called the organization and said, I can make 150 pieces of fried bannock every Tuesday. Can if somebody can pick them up? And because I knew they were delivering meals, and I said, I can do that, and and I posted a bit about it because that was kind of our, our main way of communicating during that time, all of us, and because I needed an extra electric fry pan because I was just doing this with normal kitchen things, and it was always nice. I'd have like 3 electric fry pans going outside in my backyard, and then I would also sell some of the bannock to people who wanted it just sort of for fun, and I would pick like a organization to like donate the funds to every week, and those kinds of things for me in my life, and other things are not things that show up on my resume, or it's just doing what's needed, and I do struggle a bit, and I'll probably touch on this a little bit later, but um being at an event where, somebody is a young person, adult, in school, university, is getting an award for their volunteer time for volunteering, at the prison, for example. And I found it really difficult to hear that they were getting an award for this when I had just got off the phone from talking to my brother in jail. And again, things like that don't show up on my resume. I mean, who says, and so I think there's this, fine line that we need to kind of think about, the why of why some of us are doing and engaging in these ways within the community that we're in. And yeah, and so and I'm not, I'm just talking out loud about this, and these are the things that I wonder about and hope to touch on a little bit more later as well. Thank you.
I know, I appreciate that. And I think like a thing that all of you folks are really touching on that I'm finding like really resonant is the ways that the things that you do professionally like are driven by that emotional connectivity, by that deep care and deep love and deep desire to show up in ways that feel natural and authentic. And you don't think about it as a resume builder. You don't think about it as a way to kind of like drive yourself into the next stage of your career. And I can't speak to like, anyone's individual motivations, but what I can say is that is something that we are hearing more and more, and something we want to think about when we use this word volunteer, because it's such a narrow box. You hear volunteer and you think going to a food bank from a community you're not a part of and giving back. And for I think many people, and I'd say myself included, who are in this room, the separation between service delivery and service provision and accessing and having your needs met is not a line in the sand. It's a matter of interdependence, and it's a matter of caring for the people that you exist in relation to. And so yeah, I can understand why that brings a strange feeling where you're like, oh, well, I show up for, populations that are grieving, or I show up for queer and Indigenous people, or I show up for like incarcerated people, not because I'm trying to give back, but because I'm caring for people that I love. And that is it's a very different way of interacting with that kind of community work. So I appreciate all of you sharing that. I think that actually ties really well and flows really well into our next question. So Lauren, maybe I'll make you start because it sounds like it's top of mind for you. But how would you say that concepts of kinship and reciprocity and community caregiving show up in your approach to the idea of volunteering or civic engagement or even research? What do those concepts look like for you?
Yeah, I think one example, when I was out in Kitchener-Waterloo, I was asked to run in the federal election. Um, and I was not something that was on my bucket list to do. And I do remember, my one of my aunties, who's a well-respected elder, saying to be Indigenous is to be political. And I ended up just in that example coming home to Saskatchewan and having conversations with my aunties and other people that knew me well to see if they thought that I had a skill set and could be of service in that way, essentially. And when I look back on that, I find it interesting that, I came home to Saskatchewan for that, even though I'd been asked out in Ontario. And and I learned a lot about myself during that time when I came home, and some of the skills and strengths and weaknesses that I had through these conversations. And so um and if, anything like that were to happen again, I would probably, do the same thing. Like, it just seems like the way that I would do it. Kinship, definitely goes beyond blood ties. There'll be uh, somebody I might know or have met who's, sending their child, young person, young adult, to university, and, has kind of done a bit of a handoff. And then, you immediately become the auntie to that person, and take on that role. And so the, roles and responsibilities are not defined by blood. And I think that's, important to, and that's a responsibility. And that, I think that cuts across all of our Indigenous cultures, that we know that we have that responsibility, certainly by the time we get to a certain age. um Reciprocity, I think about a lot. I work with, in my office. I connected as soon as I got back home with a knowledge keeper named Jolie Big Eagle Kikwetwe, and I knew her, from afar, from when I was here before. I knew that she was an alum of our university, and I knew she'd gone on to be an engineer, and now she was in that time she was working on a Master of Fine Arts out of Santa Fe. And I, called her, and we went out for dinner, for lunch, and started talking to her about my job, and what my sort of vision was for it, and the kind of people that I needed to surround myself um with to help guide my work. And so we started to get to know each other a little bit more, and obviously with the intent that I was hopeful that she would help advise me, and uh be involved in that. And 4 years later, our relationship is really strong. She is does a lot of work in the community, and for example, she has a winter and summer solstice pipe ceremony, and has 13 pipes. And 2 years ago, she had asked for me to come with the two-spirit pipe, and in the city at an event. And I mean, I was pretty terrified because we haven't had two-spirit pipes out in public here. And anyways, but she asked, and she was leading it. And so it wasn't about whether or not I was scared or nervous. It was about um being a part of that relationship. And she shows up for, me in the university when we need. And so me showing up as well for her, and having some of that trust that she was going to create a safe space. And I quickly made up some ribbon pants the night before. And when I was walking in that morning, and there was, some old cookums sort of sitting around, and because she'd brought in people from, outside the city as well. And I was like, they're you just getting that look on, right? And eyes locking, and um anyways. And then the one, as I was going by, I said good morning, and she just gives me a look up and down, and like a stern look on her face, and then she just said, nice ribbon pants. And then it was like, it was okay, right? But so I had to have some trust in that. And again, this weekend, I'll be going out to White Bear, to her community, where she has this. And again, I'm nervous, and about how I will be accepted, bringing my unapologetic self to that space. But she has asked, and I need to be there. And I had asked, I needed her to come to a conversation around our new strategic plan work at the university. And so the work, and having employers, educating our employers to understand, this is why you hired me, because of what I bring with me and the relationships that I'm able to build. And so you can't expect to take us and hire us and then for us to just cut off all of those relationships and show up only in the way that you need us to show up. The only reason we can get and Jolie continues to show up for us is because I commit to showing up for her and as needed and sometimes that's difficult within the parameters of our or the confines of our employment, but those are some of the ways in which I feel like I walk forward in reciprocity.
Thank you. I love that, speaking to the like fear or the like trepidation or that moment where you're like, I'm scared to do this, but I'm going to do it anyways. I think is like such an important part when you're talking about reciprocity or showing up for people that you exist in kinship or community with, like the doing it anyways, even though you're scared, and trusting that they'll show up for you is so key. Georgie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Lori, I love how you said she asked and so I need to be there. And I feel like that's such a common experience amongst Two-Spirit people. If people ask us things and there's almost no denying, like, oh yeah, I need to go there. There's no other question. I'll figure out the logistics and I'll be there. And that made me think of how I am in community, and sometimes that need shows up without even people asking. And when I moved to Kataraqui 5 years ago, and I was trying to build relationships. Something that kept happening is I kept supporting people that were going through breakups, particularly to a point where now we jokingly call myself a breakup doula, which I embrace the title fully. I think it's a wonderful title. And just seeing people who are going through these ruptures, either because of harm or because of cheating or because of different reasons that take couples apart, especially within a queer, trans, and then a polyamorous context as well. It really brings these bonding opportunities with your peers when you actively vulnerably show up for people around you who are going through hurt, and show up with just your truth, whatever you're able to provide. And I think as friends, as peers, as family members, we're never professionals on how to support one another, but we can show up to be there and we can decide to be there. And so I think that's one of the ways in which community caregiving shows up the most in my life. And ironically, that led to a lot of artistic and professional work, thinking about community accountability, thinking about transformative justice and abolition, to make sure that our communities can actively make decisions on how their future is going to look like, but also stick as a community and sustainable in decolonial and in empowering ways. And so, yeah, that connection to the personal, the kinship, and my peers and my loved ones, and wanting to support them and having this call within myself, like, oh yeah, that's something I should do and I can do, kind of led to more framework, systemic change type of thinking, I think.
Yeah, I love when the personal passion launches like systems analysis. I think that's maybe one of my favorite ways that I think change happens. Because you're right, there is something that's so beautiful about being vested in a changed future because you want the people you love to exist in that changed future. I think it's such a great guiding light. Nikki?
Um, yeah, so I think as Indigenous people on Turtle Island, every single Indigenous person that you meet has gone through some sort of survival type instincts. And so for me, that was it. From the moment that I was born, even to today, I've been living in survival mode. We all, as Indigenous people, are. And as a result of that, you really come up with innovative ways to try and support those instincts. And so for me, that's always been my drive. I had no choice, you know, being in care and running away from group homes and sleeping under staircases because I didn't want to go back to the group home because I didn't want to get beaten up, but then trying to think of ways to support myself so that I can bring myself to a place that's safer. Hasn't always been easy. Those situations are not easy for any of us. And we know we have such a high rate of Indigenous children that are in care. It's like the second kind of version of the residential school system. And so we know the struggles that our people are facing, you know, the genocide that our folks face every single day. We look at the MMIWG, and so a lot of my drive uh, comes from living in survival mode, and then trying to come up with ways to survive, and what are how can that happen. And so when I started thinking about how I was living and the barriers that I was feeling, and the barriers that were in my way, I started thinking about, okay, now how do I need to overcome that? And if I'm going through that, and I have a whole community of people that are also living in an urban setting, what are they going through, and how are they able to access? And so it was really me trying to figure out a way to build relationships with Inuit that were experiencing the same things. And so I, mobilized feasts like, hey, come together, let's have some country food, let's talk about, some of the things that we're going through and come up with innovative ways. And what was so beautiful about doing that was we were using our what we call Inuit traditional Inuit values that were created by our ancestors thousands of years ago. They were scientifically proven to work in our societies, and then they were quickly taken away from us as a result of colonization. And so, how can we bring that back into our everyday lives? And so, without even knowing it, that's what I was accessing. And I really truly believe it was my ancestors carrying me while I was going through these. To help me figure this out. It's something so magical that as Indigenous people, sometimes we can't even, you know, uh, what's the word called? I'm also going through premenopause, so that doesn't help brain fog. But that's really how we connected, and this is how we were able to, work together to come up with ways to like make a better life. And so for me, it was building those relationships with community. It was figuring out what those barriers were and figuring out how we needed to utilize, the systems that are in place to change some of those things. And so relationship building for me has always been the core of figuring out how to come up with a solution, I guess. Um, and 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 what's really, I mean, it's not funny, but what's so beautiful about it is as Indigenous people, when we first meet people, respect is at the core of who we are, and we show that by just starting a conversation. And so those are ways in which we can really be change makers, is building those relationships, having those conversations, and figuring out how we can work together to enforce, some of these critical changes that need to happen. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my answer.
I love it. And I think that I don't know, I really love when it seems like all of you have like really built upon this systems approach and the ways that you're using relationships and your personal experience to inform the way you look at systems. And I know that Géorgie, you're a consultant and you do a lot of this work kind of coming into organizations and supporting them with this work. And Nikki and Lori, I think that you both are in unique spaces, one being a sort of like nonprofit and one being an academic institution. And so I think you all, for three of you, have very unique perspectives on this next question. And so I'm excited to hear about what community impact and community defined impact specifically means to you. And then how should funders and researchers and nonprofits be held accountable to that idea? And Géorgie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the name community defined impacts is everything that we need to know about it, and we complicate it to our own deficit a lot of time. Impacts, that is defined by the communities impacted by the work we're doing. It's quite linear and cyclical at the same time. Like it's straight to the point, but we need to always come back to it. It's never a one and done type of process. And right now, I think even outside of like funder relationship, where we're seeing across Turtle Island so many opportunities to learn how community impact does not show up and what it isn't actually. We're seeing legislature being introduced that's impacting trans rights, decisions made by government destroying the lands of Indigenous nations, and all of those without the input of the people targeted by these horrifying acts. I think to Quebec particularly, with the report by Le Comité des Sages, the experts committee that the government put on trans rights, and that just put out a report just 3 weeks ago, I believe. And no trans people were on this committee. No one with expertise to trans people were put on this committee. And now they put this 300-page report telling the government what it should do. And then the report yesterday showed, the report 3 weeks ago said that they recommend, actually, one good thing is that they recommend that people be put in carceral institutions according to their gender identity, and that actually has beneficial impacts. And then yesterday, the minister of I don't know what in Quebec said that actually Quebec will be moving to putting people in institutions based on their biological sex. And so governments are contradicting themselves and making investments that's not working. I think to the elections that just happened, the federal elections as well. And I remember the Radio Canada um not battle, the I'm forgetting the word, but the conversation amongst all the leaders, and they were talking about wanting to build more pipelines of debate. Thank you so much. They were talking about building more pipelines, and they were talking about making and bringing in Indigenous communities that were going to be impacted as consultants. Like we were going to do consultations, and they're going to be part of the conversation. But taking the input of the people targeted by the work you do is not even the bare minimum of how you should be thinking of the impact of your work and then measuring it nonetheless. And so I think the people that your work impact should be making the decisions alongside you. If not, in a very land back way, make decisions themselves without your a thought or a word coming from the colonial systems themselves. And so just thinking of the community and not just thinking about them, bringing them on and letting them lead is what community defined impact should look like.
Thank you. Nikki, I saw you lean forward and you look ready.
Yes. I this is really interesting because in the work that I've done over the course of 25 years, I guess, doing community work that is also not on my resume, but it's necessary work that needs to get done. And then going back to school and figuring out how these systems work has really paved the way for me to be able to figure out really where these, and I always see this is the first time I'm like, barriers. These barriers are the drives to like figuring out how to correct those or fix them or whatever. As a community organization and being a part of community organizations for a number of years, community work is hard work. There's nothing easy about it, especially when we're working with Indigenous folks. We are, like I said again, going through so many traumas every single day. And how do you come up with innovative ways to support a community so that those feelings of despair and just not knowing what to do are being, the successes are elevating. And so, when we think about, and I'm speaking specifically to Inuit, you know, when I think about the jurisdictional issues that Inuit face from the territories to urban settings, not a lot of people know about those barriers. And these barriers are like life-saving barriers that people would never think about, like a having access to your I'm going to talk Manitoba region, but just to give you context, you know, our community members are facing life-altering processes in life because of these systems. Inuit are being denied access to various supports in urban contexts because folks in government and or in federal or provincial, municipal say, "Oh, well, you're Inuk, go to your territories and ask for help." And it's not like that. And Inuit are kind of at a place where you have to choose whether or not you live in the territories to receive the help where there are no life-saving resources, but you have no choice but to be there in order to access that somehow. And then you're in the South where people actually don't understand, or policies are not put in place to include Inuit into some of these processes. So therefore, Inuit are are really, I'm going to say, about
I don't know if this is a me internet thing or, okay.
community top of that are
Nikki, could we get you to repeat your last sentence? Because you froze for a minute and I feel like you were in the middle of just an incredibly amazing point.
You're saying that Inuit people are at about and then that block there.
And then he stopped.
okay. So Inuit. So did you hear the part where like Inuit are about 15 to 20 years behind the rest of Indigenous folks in terms of processes, access, like you name it. And so when we talk to, when we think about funders and we're applying for funding for community-based services, you know, a lot of times funders aren't even aware of the inequities and barriers that Inuit are facing in an urban context, and so therefore, you know, we feel like we're kind of being juggled around everywhere. And then you think about the reports that you have to write to showcase the work that you are doing, and the amount of time that takes away from the folks that need to be coming up with these innovative ways to support their community, those being are taken away. So what are ways that we can ensure that you know, funders are too being held accountable to the reports that we are writing? Come to a community event. Come and check out the work that we are doing, rather than having us write 20,000 words of the things and the successes, that, because we can write anything we want. Is it the truth? We don't know. But come in person, check out the space, see the community, meet the people that are doing the hard work. Those are ways in which we can start changing that narrative to incorporate the Indigenous lens. And so I hope that makes sense. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that is yeah, just so astute. I don't even have anything to add there to the ways that funders require like certain reporting that doesn't necessarily represent the needs of Inuit communities. So thank you for adding that. Lori?
Yeah, maybe just to build on that bit, Nikki, you were kind of a good segue to a couple of things that I was thinking, and you know, about making sure that the resources are accessible. You know, and that might be you know, there's certain deadlines and timelines. You know, there has to be a way to ensure that there can be in the moment oral applications or photo, you know, photo applications, and immediate access, because that's often, you know, when a resource is needed in order to have the biggest impact. And you know, like Georgie was saying, like it has to be the community deciding what the impact is, and you know, the impact of having uh shelter during the -40 weather is huge, but making a string attached to it that you need to be clean and sober, you know, disallows the opportunity for having the positive impact of somebody surviving another day. And so it's kind of like, we know what to do in the community, people know what to do, and so provide the resources and don't drive the game. But also, if we look at things like our community foundations, and I did some work in Kitchener-Waterloo, especially around the time of COVID, with more of an immediate access and different way of reporting. But I'm, just been doing a little bit of work around here too, and researching in our community foundation. I think something like less than 2% of money goes to Indigenous people, and yet, in the city we're 10% in Regina. And so I think organizations need to look at um, the demographic of who's accessing their resources, and then actually think about what barriers have I put in place that are disallowing, queer and trans youth to access our resources, Indigenous youth, Black youth, newcomers, and those sorts of things, instead of thinking that they're not applying, or they aren't interested, and those sorts of things. So I think that's an internal hard look that organizations and nonprofits and funders need to do as well.
Georgie, you had something to add there?
Yeah, Lori made me think of something as well. I was just gonna say, so often as well, when we write grants and we're being asked more and more by funders, they want to be progressive and change things up. And now you get to decide when you're writing the grant, what will impact look like for this project. And then at the end of the reporting process, they ask you, how did you reach your own impact goals? And I think so often when working in community projects, I've seen how the impact we thought we would have initially is all the way south to where we actually ended up being in terms of impact. And it was still as good, but when we're put in a box to have to meet the requirements of something we wrote probably a year and a half ago, and now we have to say how we met those exact goals. And the goals that we actually reach are quite different, but still as significant. Those processes still really do not represent the reality of community work, and they're often built so these funders can tap themselves on the shoulders and say, "Oh, look at all the good work we're funding." And please, fundies, make it clear for us. So even though we've never seen anything you've done, we can explain to other people the work that we've enabled you to do. And that lack of trust and that lack of relationship really shows off in the way that they approach our communities and what they require of our community as well.
Mm,
Yeah,
I
there's
think that
still that piece of like not wanting to give up control over deciding, the outcome that they best that a funder best wants or thinks that we need, that paternalistic, still sort of managing us versus allowing us to sustain ourselves.
Yeah, no, Lori, I think you said it perfectly. Like, I think that there's the lack of trust within a funding process like that, but also the lack of like flexibility and like generative space, I think is like can be quite limiting too, because I'm sure many of you folks know this from doing projects or doing research that like the hypothesis or the idea that you have at the beginning is not necessarily what you learn at the end, but like the fact that you've gone through it and learned doesn't mean it was a failure because you didn't get to the end point that you initially thought you would. In fact, that is a space for innovation and learning and improving. And sometimes it's like a space where you're like, oh, the thing that I thought I would have gotten is so completely different. And this new outcome is even better than what I could have imagined. And being forced to align with what you thought before you tried something new can be incredibly limiting for your ability to continue taking risks and continue innovating and continue doing things that feel impactful for your communities. And I think that you folks have also kind of spoken a little bit and touched on this like relational piece quite a bit between funders and institutions and and the sort of ways that consultation can happen. And so I'd love to like dive directly into that piece with this next question, because I think that organizations, and I'll say like Volunteer Canada, for instance, is also in this process of consultation. We are trying to speak to everyone that is touched by volunteering and touched by community organizing and touched by community participation. And I always say, so like everyone is a stakeholder, everyone is a person we need to consult as we try to like build a volunteer action strategy. But I know that a lot of organizations are in the same process where they are trying to consult Indigenous communities, they're trying to consult queer communities, they're trying to consult trans people. And I think that there's a lot of ways that that can go wrong, a lot of ways that the trust can be broken down, a lot of relational pieces that are missing that you folks have spoken about. So how do you think organizations can shift away from extractive engagement models and move towards reciprocal and relationship-based approaches to volunteering, to community partnerships, to funding, to having conversations? I don't know if anyone has an initial instinct. Lori, I'll hand it over to you because I saw you.
I have a few, sorry.
No.
Again, providing resources, sometimes that just means providing resources and backing off. It's more, and I've literally said this at vigils, which are important for us to hold, but it's like I've called people out and I've seen you at every vigil, but I haven't seen you at City Hall when we're there, trying to advocate for change. And so so there's this, and I know people often will say like, well, they don't want to get into the politics of it all, but everything about being Indigenous is viewed as being political. And I just feel like there's other ways that people can show up for us. They can amplify the event that we're putting on, or a sit-in outside the police service, because at present our police chief is on leave, probably being paid due to a harassment of the one Indigenous female board member. And then we just had another article come out in Globe and Mail about another senior cop who was using access to the phone database to connect with women who had, and the ones I know in that circumstance were Indigenous women who had been victims of violence, and so what I always struggle with is like, where's the outrage from white folks about this happening? Where's the outrage that people in these positions are um, causing this harm? And so those are places and spaces where I think people need to be showing up for us, or when we're saying that we don't want a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald in our park. um, trust that and show up for us. You don't need to we just need bodies. And sometimes there's it's this is constant work. And so, and we have a day job, and then we go on and do these other things. And it would be really great to see more people in these other spaces supporting what it is that we're trying to do, or to share our messages. Sometimes there's also this, funders or researchers, they want to start something new that they think we need. And I tell people, it's like, no, like, we don't need you to start something new, but and I don't need you to question, and put in your 2 cents worth on my social media, but you can share it. And you're going to share it to a circle, because most of the people on your Facebook look like you and think like you, and whatever. So share it. And maybe you don't completely understand it, but like, start to learn. And you can learn from our social media. Much of our advocacy has been done and continues to be done through social media and free labor of educating. And people can learn a lot. I learned so much from so many other Indigenous people, and with what they're willing to share in those spaces. And so those are some ways that are, not going to get put on your resume, and not necessarily going to get you a slap on the back in a positive way, but do some of those things. And then you don't need to tell us about it. That's the other thing. I don't need to hear how you shared my, tweet and wait for your little badge of honor from me. I mean, I'll see it. I know who does and who doesn't. But yeah, that's where I wanted to go with that.
Oh, I love that. You're like, do it and then don't tell me about it. Just do it because you know it's the thing that you're supposed to be doing. Georgie.
I love that. Yes. I think one advice that I often give to nonprofit leaders who are trying to deepen their relationships with any community, I often find myself working in solidarity-based spaces where organizations who have done harm or have many gaps in terms of servicing communities or representing or responding to their needs appropriately, then want to repair those relationships and heal them or start to build them even. And what I tell them often is to simply find their why and find clarity in their vision of the future they want to create. It's way too often these organizations, they want to deepen these relationships with marginalized communities because it seems like the right thing to do, or their annual membership survey told them that they should. And those are not good enough reasons to start doing these works, or at least they won't give you the results that not you're hoping for, but that should be happening and should come up. And so I often correlate it to gardening. And if you see that gardening right now, it's so trendy. Everyone wants to grow their own food in their backyard. And if you see that and you don't really have any attraction to gardening, but just to be trendy and to be matchy, you start to do that, but you have no motivation for it. You don't know what prep work needs to be done with the soil. You just plant things randomly here and there, and you hope for the best. And I think we all know what willy-nilly gardening gives. It gives nothing at all. It gives you one shriveled little cucumber because you didn't do the work that you actually needed to do. And it's very similar in relationship building. You actually need to work to make sure that the ground in which you're planting these seeds is clear, is healthy, is ready for the labor ahead. You need to know what foods work best next to what other food. You need to be ready also to gift this summer. It's this garden all summer long. It's not just a one and done type of moment. And so I think leaders really need to consider their why, because that's your garden foundation. Why do you actually want to develop these relationships with two-spirit communities, with queer, Indigenous communities? How do these relationships play a role in building the future that you want? What control, as we've been talking about, are you willing to give up for these people to contribute to the future that you want to create collectively? And then what are you ready to give to these relationships for them to thrive? And then to provide your communities with nourishing, with vibrant, with strong fruits and vegetables, and not just one shriveled vegetable. And when you ask yourself that, then you'll not only see growth in your work, but you'll see these communities thrive as well, because you have something to give. Even though you might not know what they might need, then it's a matter of asking as well.
I love that analogy of the garden. And I would also say that like to belabor the metaphor, I think it requires a lot of like seasonal attunement as well. Like knowing when the ground is fertile and ready to be planted in. Like it requires like I think tuning into like a schedule that exists outside of your own, like one that you don't have control over. And I
And
think that that is
yeah, and to what Lori was saying, sometimes your garden, if something's happening and there's new bugs happening, you have no clue what to do, but you just need to show up for your garden. Similarly to sometimes you don't know why you need or why these communities want this change or this policy to come in, but you need to show up without understanding sometimes, because that's what relationship and trust is about.
I love that. I think that's beautiful. Nikki?
I want to cry, Georgie. That was like,
Yes.
what a beautiful analogy. I love it, love it, love it. When I think about not, how we don't want to be so extractive as an organization, it really is for me, and for a lot of Inuit, it's incorporating our Inuit traditional values. Our Indigenous values are something so beautiful. They worked within our societies when you were guided by, your values. They really truly help to ensure that all voices are heard, that we are reciprocal to each other, that we are giving back, but and then and being able to share. And so for me, it's always ensuring that if I can follow the values that my ancestors created, and those are the same values that the organization has, then there really is no room for mistakes to happen, because then you are all working together, united voice, and coming up with solutions and innovative ways to accomplish various things. And so I feel that if we can, so yeah, all in all, uh, our Indigenous values really can create that harmonious, reciprocal, beautiful, ways of giving and taking in a way that doesn't feel so extractive.
Thank you. I really like that. I think that there's so much like information and knowledge that is passed down and often forgotten and removed and invalidated through processes of colonization and colonial structures. And like pulling back on those values and like rooting our engagement and our relationship building in that, I think is such a great way to kind of defy those structures and those powers. And so I really appreciate that. We're on to our last question, and then I see that we also have one Q&A question in the box there. So I'm going to turn this over to whoever wants to answer it first. But I think that you folks have shared so much around this kind of last thought. And so I'll leave you to respond to it however you want. But what does love look like in your community work? And how do you practice love and care in ways that you would say challenge colonial and institutional models?
Yeah, I'm happy to dip my toes in. I think love to me shows up in my work through stern compassion, and particularly care shows up through exploration of sustainable accountability practices, because we're really bad at it, unfortunately, to being accountable to one another and not lean on to cancel culture and shutting out people, especially amongst two-spirit and queer movements. It's really harsh in these moments, especially when we're put against the wall because of these policies and the rise of the extreme right. So I think I'm someone who really loves to understand why someone would do something that harms people amongst our own movement. And I am a very firm believer in Afrofeminist and liberation-oriented frameworks like transformative justice and abolition that I've mentioned earlier. And those frameworks tell us that if harm exists within our communities, it means there's something about the way we exist together that lets others believe harm is allowed and that will go unpunished. And I think our love is much stronger than what we let it be in our movement. And as we're seeing this huge wave of ruptures, of call outs amongst activists and leaders, for many different reasons, and most of them valid as well, although we sometimes claim to be better than colonial institutions like carceral industrial systems, then we just reproduce the same harm by shunning each other out of our so-called safe spaces. And then we forget way too quickly about the values that actually guide our work on the day-to-day. And so figuring out how we live together, knowing that harm is going to happen, but while also showing up with stern compassion that enables everyone's dignity, but that doesn't allow for harm to go unaddressed or unnoticed, while stopping the cycle of isolation and shaming. I think that's a major question that I dedicate myself to, but that we need to ask ourselves as communities, as movements. And luckily, we can lean on the strong leaders across Turtle Island that have been doing this work since the 80s and the 90s. This is nothing new, and these are not unanswerable questions, but they're just so hard to work through while surviving in the systems that we're in right now. Hyper independence and wanting to prioritize your own survival is so easy to fall into, and I fall into it so many times when I'm faced with conflict and with challenges in community work. But to walk a little bit further and to challenge those, then that really leads to the future we want and not just what we imagine in our head.
Thank you for that, Georgie. I don't think I've heard of the term specifically stern compassion, and I think that is so beautiful because there's something so loving but so firm in it, and I think love can look really firm.
Mhm.
I think it's easy to assume that love means like no one ever has their feelings hurt or harm never happens, but I think that I often say to people is I think that to let yourself close enough to someone to be cared for also means letting yourself close enough to them to often be hurt in really, really major ways. And I think that figuring out the ways that we work through it and then show up for each other is
Mhm.
an incredibly, incredibly important endeavor in the work that we do moving forward. So thank you for that.
Good much.
Nikki?
So for me, we have the highest suicide rates in all over the world in Inuit Nunanga. Sorry. Whew. And you know, a lot of lateral violence that transpires within our own communities. And we see this every single day. I've certainly been accustomed to you know, those awful life experiences, and they're hard, and we deal with it every day in all of our communities. And having gone through, you know, some of the challenges I've gone through growing up has also helped me to show up in ways that I wish I had growing up. Sorry, being a little emotional. And so I think as a result of my lived experience and seeing the struggles of Inuit from all over Canada, you know, it's important for me to again, it's our Inuit kayo mayutukingin values. I'm guided by that. That's my backbone. That is how I show up, not only for myself, for my children, for my partner, but for my community. And it has hurt me in ways, definitely, because our communities are suffering, but it has also shown me and given me so much to learn from and to be guided by that. You know, there is no wrong in that. And so if I can do that and show love to my community in that way, then I feel like I'm doing a service. And I will continue to do that, and I will continue to fight for the rights of Inuit, to fight for support and for recognition and inclusion. It's something that I've been doing my whole life, and as long as I can do that with my heart, you know, showing love, and being just raw and true to who I am, then I feel that people feel that energy and feel that can show up as love as well. And so, and I think that's how I do that. So
Thank you, Nikki. And I want to say I appreciate your ability to show up here so human and so vulnerable and so open. I don't take that lightly, and I know no one here takes that lightly either. It is a gift to be allowed to hear you and share space with you. And so I do want to thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that trust. Lori.
I think I where do I want to go with this? I think I because I have this leadership role in the institution, and I remember before I moved home to take on this new position, I was out in Waterloo, and I called my auntie and said, you know, this opportunity back home has, you know, come to light, and first thing she said, well, it's about time you came home, which I thought was funny because when I went away, she was like, yes, go do that job. But you know, that's also, you know, rooted in past um rituals of, having people go away to learn a bit and to bring back. It's also good for building relationships and whatever, but so you're not intended to stay away forever. But um, and then the conversation went on to, she's like, you need to do another fast. And I was like, oh, I did one of those, oh, really, Auntie? Like, I'm like, it's so hard. Why do I, and I felt like this like whiny, teenage version of me. And she was just like, uh sternly loving with me, if I can go to that word. And and said, like, you're gonna take on this job, and it's a new position. No Indigenous person has ever had the privilege of, holding that position. You're going to be with this group of executives in that boardroom all the time, and you're gonna it's going to be hard to be your authentic self all the time, and you're going to get tired, and sometimes you might just want to fit in and be flippant about something or a joke or something just to fit in. And she says, but you can't, because if you do that, you will cause harm to whoever comes in to that role after you, and it will cause harm to Indigenous students, staff, and faculty, and our community. And so she said, so you have to go to FAST again, because she said you need to be able to uh, sort of, move through that suffering when you're tired, when you're mentally drained, when you're physically drained, all of those things. And that discipline will help you to be a better leader. And she also said, when she said that, I could, probably make some really blatant, horrible mistakes because I, wasn't putting care into my work. And she said, you'll be fine. You're educated, Indigenous professional, and somebody else will hire you, but that harm, would be a legacy that's left. And so um, I think about that a lot in my responsibility. And if I come to a time where I feel that I can't do that anymore, then, knowing when to step back, and hopefully, having surrounded myself by the right people, if I don't see it, trusting if they bring it to my attention that, it is a time to step back. There's some other things I did, again, when they hired me, and I, told them, well, you're hiring me, like I mentioned earlier, because of my community connections, my commitment to ceremony, to my lodge, all of these things, and therefore those past relationships and commitments have to be honored. And so, yes, sometimes I will go to an event, a cultural event, as part of my work, but I also have responsibility to my own lodge and for my own spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional well-being, and that's not vacation. And so I did got into my contract that I need ceremonial leave for my own well-being so that I can bring myself to this job, and that was supported. And so that did take some education to do that. And then I try to just talk normally like they talk about their lives. And, and so there's um whether it's just talking about, my mom's most recent overdose, and, what I got going on with that, or my, brother who's living rough right now, and how I hope people, when they see these certain couple people out at this one intersection in town, that they always give them a little bit of change. And I said, I do, because I hope somebody's giving change to my brother, up in Ontario, because he needs it. And so I think sometimes, like, those are like some of those taboo conversations that aren't supposed to happen amongst colleagues at work, or really in boardrooms. And but um I try to ensure that I do voice those things, and let people know that this is my life, this is my reality. Um, yes, I do speak and do some statements on behalf of the university, but when they called, because the media was calling and they wanted a statement after one of the local residential schools, when they discovered children's graves, I literally said to the president, I said, you need to tell media to give me a moment because I'm fielding calls from my family and community members, and I'm living this experience in real time. And media needs to understand that they don't need a knee-jerk relation. And so I've done education like that for my peers, and they've responded. And so they work to, and I know everybody does not have that. I do feel very fortunate with the leadership that I have right now at the university that I work at. But they've responded positively to those ways that are not common within our university setting. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think that those negotiations and those ways that you're, like you were saying, the ways that you're advocating for yourself and normalizing conversations that are so incredibly important. Like I just hope that you realize all of the things that you sort of initially thought about when coming into this role will change that environment for the better for the next person that comes after you and for students. Because I think that I can't imagine that the university would have ever even considered leave for ceremony or for like well-being in that way prior to you making that like point of advocacy for yourself. We have two questions actually from the audience, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to say both of them, and I'm actually just going to allow each of you to respond to the ones that sort of resonate most with you, because I think they're both really interesting. I think the first one is from an anonymous attendee, and it's, what are some ways that volunteering contributes to ongoing colonization? And then the second one is a little bit more personal about the ways that you approach your work, and it's around work-life balance. And it asks how you folks create capacity for yourself while doing this much needed work within your organizations and in the wider community.
I'm just going to say I live, breathe, work, everything related to Inuit. And so I feel like there's no escaping some of the challenges that our communities are facing daily, but really a way that I definitely ground myself is being with my children, being with my partner, and just showing up for them in ways that sometimes because life gets so busy can kind of escape you, but if I can show up for my family and for my children, then I feel then that's my way of grounding, because as an Inuk woman, having lived experience and being in a position that I am in, those are just the way it is, and being a matriarch in my family, and being the one of the first lesbians in my family. I mean, it's definitely a feat that isn't easy, especially because of colonization and the effects that Inuit have had so close in terms of like, as little as 50 years ago. And so, yeah, I know that's probably not the greatest answer to give, and I'm still figuring all of that work-life balance stuff out. But I really feel like as Indigenous folks that we're kind of caught in some of the work that we do in our community.
There's no wrong answer. I think that's only an honest one. And I think being rooted and balanced in your family and your children is a beautiful way to keep that going.
I think also for me, like I try to share the message too. It's um just checking in, you know, with people, um not being okay when someone doesn't show up for something, from our community. It can be a lot, and trusting that it's they need that time to take care of themselves. Reminding, we have a Two-Spirit ceremonial lodge, and I work very closely with the elders, and pretty much all our lodge members are a fair bit younger than me, and and I recognize that also how I model will also impact how they think that they need to be as far as showing up. And so I do, try to talk a lot about the care and kindness, and the spaces. You don't need to show up in every space. yes, in my interview for my job, I had an angry Indigenous person. I think he was just angry at women, but if I have a sweat, will you come? And anyways, but it was not said in a good way. And I said yes. I said if I'm invited, I would come. Now, what I didn't say was I wouldn't be going in a sweat with you, but I would show up. But and knowing that you can say no and it's okay. You don't need to subject yourself to violence, abuse, verbal, any of those things, and that's okay. And you can retreat and take the time that you need to be loving and kind to yourself.
Yeah, my go-to is water. Water is my favorite medicine. That's why I settled here in Cataraqui because we have access to the beautiful Lake Ontario, but we're also surrounded by so many bodies of water everywhere. And so I have my like 3 lovely friend lakes that I go to on like a weekly basis. One of them particularly has a hobby farm right next to it with tiny ponies, and so is big with animals. And on the land, it's truly just so fulfilling. And I think water leads to a lot of healing conversations with friends and partners and communities as well. And so I tend to bring someone and debrief things by the water, and adds a lot of fluidity to conversations, and it heals a lot of the heaviness and the pains that come with the heaviness of the work that we do. And briefly to touch on the ways volunteering contributes to ongoing colonialism, I was just gonna say, one, by making volunteering so inaccessible, because within capitalism, it's very elite a little bit to do volunteerism, because you need to make a living. And when you invest time in something, when you can't afford groceries, it's hard to justify doing it for free. And then we touched upon that a lot. And especially I think back to Lori when you were talking about that example of who gets an award based on what work they do. It also creates this hierarchy of what is considered valuable volunteering. Is it being associated with an institution, an organization, and having a report card that says how many hours you invested in the last quarter, or is it actually holding someone's hand while they go through some hard stuff? Yeah, that hierarchy also reproduces a lot of that colonialism mindset.
Thank you. I feel that it feels so rushed to be like, I just had this incredibly transformative hour and a half of being able to be in a space with you all where you shared such incredible insights, and now we have to go back off into the world. But I want to thank all 3 of you for your insights, for your knowledge, for your sharing of experiences and practices. And I want to thank everyone who joined us, those who shared questions, those who were active in the chat. Yeah, I cannot express how valuable this was to me. And I also want to thank you on behalf of Volunteer Canada as well, because I know that everyone on our team that's listening, who is both in this room today and who is also joining from the other side of the webinar, like there was so much richness and so much intentionality and so much vulnerability and so much insight here. I can't imagine spending a better hour and a half on a very, very hot Thursday. So I want to thank you all, our panelists, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I hope that the words that our panelists shared allow for just meaningful engagement and work and thought and reflection on the ways that we show up for our communities moving forward. So thank you all so much.